please welcome Managing Director of Atlantic Live, Emily Akhtarzandi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Akhtarzandi, Managing Director of Atlantic Live, and I'm pleased to welcome such a great group this morning. Atlantic Live is the live events division of The Atlantic, and we are proud to bring this great publication's journalism to life on stage with in-depth coverage of the most consequential issues of our time. Today's program builds off of decades of reporting and commentary by The Atlantic on an issue that undoubtedly is deeply personal to nearly everyone: housing. Housing is a basic human need, but is also a commodity, one that is still not available to everyone in fair measure. We'll talk today about the legacy of the Fair Housing Act, which came at a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement of the 60s. Once signed into law in 1968, the act made it illegal to refuse to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of his race, color, religion, or national origin. The law's language embodies the pursuit of justice and equity for all people in the United States. And as we look back today, we ask how the Fair Housing Act's original intent has weathered the past 50 years. What have we accomplished in combating housing discrimination and segregation, and what remains to be done? So this morning, we'll hear the stories of people who are pursuing solutions on local and national levels and thinking through the big questions that impact us all. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our underwriter, Fannie Mae, for making today possible. And before we jump in, a few housekeeping notes. If everyone could silence your cell phones, but keep them out to follow the conversation on Twitter at Atlantic Live using the hashtag #AtlanticBuildingEquity. And we also want to hear from everyone in this room today as well, so we're going to take questions throughout the morning as the panels end. So let's jump in. We'll begin today's program with a look back at what was happening in many American communities in the 50s and 60s, when segregation was the norm and discriminatory practices were not yet outlawed across the country. It was under these circumstances that many Americans of color faced grave challenges trying to purchase a home of their own. The following Atlantic video introduces the story of the Contract Buyers League, a group of residents in Chicago who banded together to fight discriminatory housing practices in their neighborhood. Let's take a look.
The question of housing is one of the major problems this country faces. By and large, blacks live in substandard housing. Those who manage to fight their way out of it frequently pay a large penalty to do so.
I came from Birmingham, Alabama, but I came to Chicago for a better living and a job. I bought here, this house, in '58. It ain't nothing to brag about, but it's mine.
My name is Clyde Ross. I was born in Clarksville, Mississippi. I bought this house in 1958.
I moved in this house in 1957. It was mostly a white area. And when they said that the niggers was coming, they didn't say black, they said the niggers was coming. And they just start moving away. Mostly everyone that was black, they had been sold a contract. If you missed the payment in 3 months, they could take the property back. No lawyer, no nothing could help you. That was it.
There are blocks like this scattered throughout the Lawndale section of Chicago's West Side Ghetto. The people who live here bought their homes from real estate speculators at double or triple their value, and they bought on contract because they couldn't get conventional or FHA mortgages. Under the contract, the buyer makes installment payments at high interest, but he bills no equity. If he defaults on even one payment at any time during the contract, he loses the property and everything he's paid into it.
Go pay $26,000 and the house was worth $12,000. That means I was overcharged quite a bit. And the contract situation was so bad until, well, if something broke down, you had to fix it. You had to pay your water and gas and electric and the taxes and everything else, but you didn't have no ownership.
How could we be charged like that if that wasn't a law? And how would the law let them do this? But they said it was their property. They had a choice to sell it at whatever price they wanted to. And if you bought it, then that was on you.
Worked 3 jobs. I worked at Campbell Soup, post office, and I delivered pizzas for 4 to 5 years. I get home at 10 o'clock every night, you know. Leave home at 6 o'clock every morning. Kids be asleep, they don't see me. And when they did see me on the weekend, I tell them something, they look at their mama and say, well, should I do it or should I not? Do with this guy, you know? I was a stranger in my own home because of this contract thing. Really a stranger. I said, now this is not gonna work.
These people who have cheated us out of more than money, we have been cheated out of the right to be human beings in a society. We have been cheated out of buying homes at a decent price. Now it's time now. We got a chance now. The Contract Buyers League have presented a chance for these people in this area to move out of this grip of society, to move up, stand on your own 2 feet, be human beings, fight for what you know is right. Fight!
I really believe that, you know, ultimately what we're after is some kind of communication among human beings, but that can only be effected when people can approach each other on the basis of equality.
Yeah, but even though you are keeping within the law, this is really war, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
The college students and I went up and down the streets and asked people if they bought on contract. And we discovered that the average overcharge was $10,000 and then computed the monthly payments so that we knew that black folks were paying a race tax of about $20,000 per family.
To continue the story of the Contract Buyers League, please welcome to the stage Ralph Blessing, who volunteered at the Contract Buyers League as a student organizer, and Sandra York, a daughter of Ruby and Robert York, who bought a home in North Lawndale and whose decision to participate in the Contract Buyers League helped the organization make history. And to lead the conversation, please welcome Atlantic staff writer Van Newkirk. Van, please take it away.
So Ralph, we, in that video, you know, we just saw that race tax of $20,000 per family. You got involved with the Contract Buyers League after they found that out. What was the Contract Buyers League, what were their objectives and how did you meet those objectives?
Well, the objectives originally of the organization were to discover that type of data, which in today's dollars doesn't sound like a significant amount, but at the time, if you saw those housing prices on that list, imagine what that would be in today's dollars. It amounted to roughly a 75% markup on average between what the sellers paid for the property, often just days earlier, and turned around and sold it to a black family at an inflated rate. So this took a while to get that information out of the community because there was a hesitancy to basically admit that you were taken advantage of. But when you're desperate for housing and desperate for a place to raise your kids, and people do desperate things, and sometimes you may not even think it's a viable solution, but you sign on the dotted line and you had a house. Only later did they find out that they and their neighbors were really the result of a, if not illegal, certainly unethical campaign by blockbusters and people who were willing to take advantage of them because of the color of their skin.
So you had a house, but you weren't building equity, right?
Exactly.
And so how were people, when the Contract Buyers League decided to act against it, they were withholding their payments, correct? That
was not the initial step, but the effort, the documentation was made of what the difference between the buying and selling price, and presented to them, to the sellers, I guess, and requesting that they renegotiate the contracts and make them closer to a mortgage, if not in fact an actual mortgage, except for one individual apparently who had a come to Jesus moment and woke up, and his wife convinced him that they had overcharged. They had cheated the buyers, and the rest of the real estate folks just said, we're not. It's legal. They signed it. Tough nails, if you will. And so when they resisted any effort to renegotiate, that is when this tactic came up of we will withhold our payments, our monthly payments. We will make them into an escrow account, so the money is there. It's not that we're trying to avoid paying the money, but we will not give it to them. And that eventually enticed a number of the others to enter into renegotiations of the contracts.
You say essentially that this was considered to be a legal practice. You did take legal action, correct? There was a lawsuit?
There was a lawsuit, actually two of them, one for the West Side community and later on for a group of homeowners in the South Side. But after years working its way through the system, these cases were dismissed, so that they did not resolve the matter. But I think renegotiations ended up benefiting over 300 homeowners in the Lawndale community over the course of the years that this process was underway.
Sandra, we talked about your family history yesterday. We had lunch. You were telling me about the roots of your family in Mississippi and how they come up and get this home that's considered a part of the American dream, correct, but it's on contract.
Yes.
What have you learned from your parents about their story, about their motivation to buy a house, about how they felt after realizing this contract was just a disadvantageous device?
Well, remember, I also indicated that my parents actually hid us from a lot of what was going on. But in asking questions later on and, just the unfairness of what happened, they just always told us to fight for what you believe in. And that's what they did, and they came out on top.
And do you think there was a sense of, in North Lawndale, other communities, a sense of maybe shame that they had been hoodwinked?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My dad even, he just told my mom, do not go to those meetings. And she was like, no, I'm going. This has to be done.
She went anyway?
She went anyway.
And how the situation, what was the resolution? What was the course of events there?
They actually did do the renegotiating, and they actually came out on top. I think it was like in the range of like $8,000 or something like that.
$8,000.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you growing up, now with this $8,000 returned to your family, what was your sense of how it impacted your family's sense of belonging, your sense of community, and your love for North Lawndale.
Oh, I love the community. I mean, I loved being there. You know, the family and other families that were there as well. Just, I mean, the pride that they had in the community, and we just, you know, we felt like we could really stand tall, you know, because of what my mom and, you know, and eventually my dad, who did come along, you know, they stood up. You know, we were very proud of that.
What's it like for you watching that video, seeing all those folks who were in it with your parents, going through all this? And I think the line that gets me is the woman who says, "It's not much, but it's mine."
Correct.
Like, you know, that's heavy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but they made us feel like we were rich. I mean, we had everything. I mean, everything that we needed, and that was the love and strength and, you know, their determination. That's what we had.
Ralph, Contract Buyers League was an interracial effort, right? There were lots of people from lots of places, races, class bases involved in this. What about your own background, your family background, gets you to go and volunteer for this organization that's doing something really risky?
Actually, I was only with the other students for a 2-week period during the summer of 1967. I went to work straight out of high school and was working at an insurance company, and my brother was part of that student group, recruited by Jack McNamara. And so I thought, what better way to spend my 2-week summer vacation than hanging around Lawndale? And so I did a bit of canvassing and the like at that point, but I went into Peace Corps later on, and after returning, contacted Jack and said, I'd really like to spend time working with CBL. And by that time, a fundraising foundation had been established, and so I ended up working there, in effect, as a paralegal with the legal teams that were doing pro bono work on behalf of CBL. So it allowed me to interact with the buyers on a regular basis, interviewing them, getting the kind of data that would be needed to argue the case in court. But what motivated me to, I don't know, I was a child of the 60s, so I guess maybe that was it as much as anything.
But it doesn't just stop for you with the CBL. You live in a community now in DC that's also gone through similar changes, through similar instances of segregation. What's your lifelong experience and engagement and interface with housing segregation been like? And now that we are decades past, what's your sense, looking back, what are the trends been?
It's hard to say. I grew up in a very working class neighborhood where I was told the original settlers were the African Americans who were next door and a couple of doors up, and that my dad knew growing up, and so it was sort of that struggle, if you will, between my white classmates at the Catholic school I attended and the folks I knew from childhood who were my neighbors. But I eventually just, as the civil rights movement took hold in the U.S., it really resonated with me, and I just felt that was the way to go for my own personal convictions and practices to the extent possible.
Sandra, you've since moved on from your parents' home, from that contract house. What emotions were you having when you bought your own home and thinking about legacy, inheritance, that same sentiment of it's mine?
Yeah. The feeling was just, and I don't want to get emotional either. I knew that my mom and dad would be very proud that I had the support from so many who, you know, made sure that I didn't go through what they went through. So.
And they're with you. And
yeah.
We talked about how you were advised when you went through this process of not to seek an FHA loan. So this is like
correct.
Coming back in history, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's coming back to you.
It's coming back, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Ralph, I want to get your sense of, we're sitting here thinking about this now 50 years on, the impact of the CBL, not just in North Lawndale, not just in Chicago, but in how we think about this problem today nationwide.
I guess I wish I could say it had a distinctly positive impact, but just from what you hear in recent months, years, I guess even during the housing crisis, how people lost their homes to begin with, and how properties were gobbled up and resold in some cases on, if not contracts, something very much like a contract. So I guess the greatest impact would be the awareness that organizations like CBL have helped create in the population as a whole, that the fact that this many people would come out to listen to an event like this or a discussion like this, and it's just 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and it's an ongoing struggle.
For me, Sandra, I think the fact that you're here is an optimistic sign. I mean, we talked about this again yesterday, how you had a chance to talk to and engage with Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. That video was a supplement to his groundbreaking case for reparations, right? So I think people now nationwide are considering, even if housing segregation is still entrenched, thinking about solutions. Correct. How do you see that movement, the impact, what your parents went through and advised you on, beyond your own experience to the people the young folks now in your community? Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Whenever I just even hear of a young person wanting to buy, you know, and it's like, oh, we need to have a conversation, you know, and, you know, make sure you check all avenues, you know, do your homework. There are resources out there, people who will help. You just need to just say something, you know, and a lot of times I think from back then that people, they just didn't share. And it wasn't that they didn't want to share, but people just felt like, you know, this was just a bad experience and let me just move on from it, you know, and not share anything, so.
I want to queue up for questions soon, so everybody start thinking about your good questions. Just one more for you, you know, that what we pass down, especially as black folks. What are you telling young people who are seeking their own homes? It's still this very American sense of that you have carved out your space and done what you need to do as a good American. What are you warning people against? What are you telling them is the right way to go? How do you pass it
on? Just letting them know, you know, 1, keep good credit. But 2, like I say, just knowing your options, knowing what's out there, you know, FHA as opposed to conventional. You know, what may work better for you as opposed to, you know, what worked for me. You know, there's particular situations, how much house they want, you know, where you want to move to, you know. So, I mean, I'm having those conversations quite often, yeah.
Okay.
Gail Woodward, and I used to work in politics in Georgia, and one of the main things I saw as far as taking housing away from people was the privatization of tax collection. And I was wondering if y'all have had any experience with that. If the accountable government officials just outsource the collection of past due property taxes, then it makes it easier to avoid accountability for pissing off a big group of people that they screw over.
I'm not familiar with that myself.
Neither am I. Oh, for 3, but I think that's a great question, and I'm going to keep it in my back pocket for a story, maybe. So, anybody else?
Hi, I'm Deborah Cole, and I was just wondering, did that exactly end the contract buying process? Were other homeowners going forward, were they offered regular mortgages, or did it just ease the terms of the contracts, and did they continue?
My understanding, since I was no longer in Chicago at the time, but is that once this matter was being resolved for the original group of homeowners through renegotiations, that the FHA admitted the error of its ways to a certain extent. The banks in Chicago were willing to lend a hand in furthering the renegotiation process, making future potential buyers accessible, or having standard mortgages accessible to them, much more so at least than they have been in the past. So, but whether that's, how far along that, I mean, did that, we know it's still not totally a level playing field. So when you've got wealth that's accumulated generation after generation, when two groups of people are in different tracks, then the credit worthiness, if you will, is identified in this manner versus that manner. And so,
Sandra said to keep good credit, but you already start from a deficit, right, with the credit?
I think so, yes. I mean, it's, and again, when it's not just the financial aspect, as Clyde Ross said in the video, when you are away from your home 80, 90% of the time, what does that do to family life? If we know how important it is to have a male figure, father figure in the house, and yet if the kids look at him and said, "Who are you?" It's just such a widespread issue, and it's more than a dollar and cents matter.
Devin Bunton, I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and this question is mine, not theirs. I'm required to tell you. So as an economist, I quickly adjusted the $8,000 that you got back from New York for inflation, and that's about $70,000, depending on what exactly year we're speaking, which is a sizable fraction of the racial wealth gap today between black families and white families. And so I wondered if you or anyone on the panel had any thoughts on that. It was reflecting sort of the magnitude of the issues for families and sort of keeping class distinctions and race distinctions in line.
No, I certainly didn't. I mean, if I benefited from it in terms of, you know, of course my dad supported us, but he kept it close to the vest. But I'm not.
I think you're right. That's $70,000 today in today's dollars.
Yeah.
It matters a lot, but it doesn't close the gap. And so I think we still have lots ahead of us to think about just how big that gap really is, and not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of hours missed with your family and other ways that people are involved in closing it. And so you're actually going to hear some more of that later today. So thank you for your questions.
And 70,000, if you had that money back then, you could have grown that money, in effect. So it's not just a stable or a static number, which, again, helps explain the disparity, the white-black disparity in terms of accumulated wealth over generations.
Well, I want to thank you all for your amazing questions. That question was great. And thank you to Ralph and to Sandra for coming and for sharing your insights in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Van.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Now for a conversation on the legacy of the Fair Housing Act, please welcome Howard Husick, Vice President of Research and Publications at the Manhattan Institute, Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and Dave Stevens, President and CEO of the Mortgage Bankers Association. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome Atlantic Senior Editor Jillian White.
Good morning. So I want to start with a little bit of a framing question that I want to put to all of you, and that is, to what extent have the goals of the Fair Housing Act been achieved in the past 50 years? Dave, I want to start with you.
You know, I think it's a mixed story. I think on the one hand that, you know, there's clear laws in place that eliminate, or at least make it legally culpable to discriminate based on race, sex, etc., sexual preference. But we still live in a world today where the opportunity for home ownership and for safe housing has great disparities in it. So, you know, it's an area that needs a lot of work, and I actually think right now the timing is really important for this conversation because in many ways we're in a housing crisis when you look at the cost of housing and who's getting access to it. There's massive disparities between the white non-Hispanic population and minority communities, so that's something that needs a lot of focus.
Vanita?
I think the promise of the Fair Housing Act remains to be fully realized. Obviously, when it was enacted a week after Martin Luther King's assassination, came after many years of advocacy to try to get it enacted, and it holds a lot of really important principles. Housing is the basic block of our communities, and the right to safe and accessible housing is a really core part of how we live. But I think the reality is that there have been a long series of, decades of federally engineered segregation, and we remain deeply segregated in housing, which has impacts on education, transportation, access to employment. Studies show that Black home ownership rates today are at the levels they were 50 years ago because despite a lot of progress that had been made, the 2008 financial crisis really wiped a lot of that out, and the recovery has not been equally felt by all communities. And so, again, we have always throughout our history made enormous progress, and the enactment of laws has been a marker and milestone of that progress. But the fact remains that when laws don't get fully implemented, and I think actually the Fair Housing Act is one of the laws that has probably been the most subject to political whim of our landmark civil rights legislation. So you've seen leaps forward and leaps back, administration to administration. It's really halted the ability for the act to be fully implemented with the rigor that was intended by the folks who had been really pushing for it. So there's a lot of work to do to really address profound segregation. And we have to remember that there's no naturally occurring phenomena about why segregation exists. It's manufactured by human beings, and therefore to be undone requires an explicit and intentional set of policies and practices to be able to address that kind of longstanding segregation.
Well, I think one would have to be incredibly naive not to think and understand that it's more difficult and more complicated to rent or buy a home if one is an African American. I think that was true when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and I think it has continued to be true. However, there has been some important changes. Colleagues of mine, Ed Glazer, who was an economist at Harvard, and Jacob Vigdor, who was an economist at the University of Washington, looked at the census data. And today, segregated neighborhoods, as defined by racial concentration, are far less common than they were at the time of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. 50 years ago, 20% of census tracts in the United States had 0 Black residents. Today, for every 200 neighborhoods in the United States, 199 are not all white. That is, there are Black residents in virtually every census tract. That may not mean a lot. It may not mean that they're not having a hard time getting a house there, but all white neighborhoods in the United States are effectively extinct. Even in Chicago, if you look at what's called, economists call the dissimilarity index, how different is one neighborhood from another neighborhood? Is it all one race or is it all one other race? Overall dissimilarity in Chicago known as one of the most segregated cities in the United States, has declined between 1970 and 2010 by 25 percentage points. Agree, work to be done, and the government may not have done a good job implementing the law, but mortgage bankers all post that sign up, Fair Housing Act, and it makes a difference.
Can I just, one point to, and there's a lot of data, and you can say that's gentrification causing the, and affordable housing that's creating some of this change in certain communities, particularly in urban communities. But you know, one of the things I look at, which I think is a real testament to the challenge that we face, is the median FICO score for African Americans in this country, and this is just fact, is 624. The median FICO score for all Americans is about 719. If you look at lending policies, even under qualified mortgage rules, most lenders, even FHA, most lenders won't lend in those programs below around 620 without adding, with FICO scores below 620. So you got the median FICO score for African Americans, 624, and once you drop below 620, which is about half of that population, you end up finding it harder to access credit. What's most interesting about that is a large percentage of that population that's below 620 has thin file credit, meaning less than 2 reported credit histories. If you're an Uber driver, Uber doesn't report your loan for your car. Your utilities often aren't reported. Your rent payments aren't reported. Your car loan that you got from a used car dealer or subprime auto dealer, those typically are not reported to your credit histories. And so you end up with a reality that the lack of credit also creates bad credit. And so the question is, you know, we can talk about the problems, but we need to be talking about the opportunities when we solve for it. And I think, unfortunately, some of the square peg, square hole underwriting mentality that we've created, on the one hand, eliminates the ability for too much subjectivity, which can protect against redlining and those kinds of things. At the other end, how do we solve for it if the system being used, and I'll use the credit scoring one as a prime example, ultimately causes these incredible disparities. So that's something I think all of us need to think about focusing on.
Well, I want to ask the question then, whose responsibility is it to help fix that? As you said, we have a thin credit file problem that tends to afflict people of color more so. That means that they cannot get houses, they can't get conventional loans. That is how families build their wealth. So it creates this cycle where it becomes impossible or near impossible to build the kind of wealth, to have a home, someplace where it's going to appreciate in value. So whose responsibility is it, and how can we fix that?
Well, you're looking at me, so I'll answer quickly. I know everybody has thoughts here. You know, there's tipping points on all sides. When I came into the Obama administration in 2009 as Federal Housing Commissioner, there was a program called, which was seller-funded down payment assistance. That was an effort to actually try to help people without down payments buy a home, and it became a seller-funded program. That had default rates, cumulative default rates of about 35%, and that was heavily concentrated in minority communities, which I think were preyed upon, quite frankly, by people who saw that as an opportunity to use that program, and I won't go into all the reasons as to why it failed, but the outcome was real. So we've got to be careful about those tipping points. I do think one of the great opportunities right now is to be looking at the buyer of today, who have multiple sources of income in their household, some of which are not reported in traditional ways, that may have multiple family members living with them that support their income stream. We've talked about those who drive for Uber and other kinds of self-employed vehicles, or rent out part of their homes through some of the services online to generate income. But all of this leads me to start off with something at its base level. Why are we still relying on a traditional credit scoring methodology that underscores demographics that may just simply not have the traditional way of establishing a credit score, when that is one of the primary drivers to getting a prime rate on a mortgage? And by the way, I'm way overlooking affordable housing stock and wage separation and all of these things that pile on the economics of being able to get access to housing. But what we really need is, we need a universal focus to say we're in a housing crisis. And believe me, when you look at the poverty levels of those who can't even afford minimum rents today, it's dramatic. Anyway, so I'll shut up. But I think, you know, in the end of the day, we've got a lot of work to do. Someone's got to declare this as a national priority.
So I think that's, I agree with a lot of the stuff on credit, and I think sometimes with the Fair Housing Act, people forget that there was like huge parts of this act that were about access to credit, which frankly goes to almost every aspect of life that we live. But I mean, the responsibility is a shared one, and I agree that we don't feel like we're in a crisis on housing, but in communities of color and certain other communities, it is a profound crisis and remains one. And I headed up the Civil Rights Division for the last almost 2.5 years of the Obama administration, where we enforced the Fair Housing Act, and there were efforts by HUD at that point to put out rules that were giving teeth to the Fair Housing Act through the affirmatively furthering fair housing order. So there were a number of things that were happening around government. The federal government has a huge role to play because they also had a huge role to play in fueling segregation and segregated housing, in unequal access to credit and the like. And you can't undermine that. And the role of the federal government to give meaning to the Fair Housing Act remains still alive, despite the rollbacks that we're currently seeing, both across enforcement at the two agencies that enforce. But there's also a great responsibility among banks. And I think that there's, for lending institutions to get engaged in this effort. And we've seen a lot of banks really take this take initiative and leadership to address these issues. There's been more of a move to address how criminal convictions, criminal records are also creating the vast racial disparities that we're seeing in barring people from accessing everything from public housing to private housing and to credit. And I think there's been a lot of leadership among some key banks recently to kind of deal with that in the absence of a federal government that has made this a priority. And so, there's a lot of shared responsibility here, but I think it's absolutely true that given the importance of housing in our lives and in our communities, there needs to be a much, much greater focus on what's happening right now.
On the credit score issue, I want to link that back to the point about the high foreclosures and the financial crisis and how that's disadvantaged wealth creation in the minority community. I couldn't agree more with that. And I think we have to be very careful to the point about that high foreclosure rate on the experimental HUD program. We do not do anybody a favor if we relax credit requirements too much, right? Asset growth, wealth creation happens when whole neighborhoods remain good. The worst thing, I remember in the early days of the housing crisis, visiting the back of the yards, which is also in Chicago, and going door to door talking to people for a magazine article about what did it mean to have a foreclosed house next to you. Decimating. Working class people who have the house next door be vacant, that is a nightmare for them. We have to protect them by making sure that good credit is extended to people who are credit worthy. That has always been a protection for neighborhoods. Do we have to be expansive about understanding who is a good credit risk? Yes. But when we have affordable housing goals, sometimes we may stretch those too far, and we have to be careful, not because we're worried about banks, but because we're worried about minority homeowners. And in that context of wealth creation, we do have to keep in mind the FHA back in the bad old days redlined and had a lot of the discriminatory practices we heard about in the first panel. At the same time, when it comes to wealth creation, we have to remember what a nightmare public housing was for minority people. We don't want to think of it that way. If you look at the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis, the neighborhoods that were wiped out there, my own census research found that 21% of the homes were owned by minorities. They were torn down to make public housing in which nobody could own anything. We have to be careful to bring in the government to fix the problems because the government doesn't have a great track record of its own.
I want to talk about what would constitute keeping a neighborhood good. Because historically, keeping a neighborhood good in the United States has meant making it more white than it is minority.
Absolutely not.
You say absolutely not, but I mean, there's a lot of evidence that shows...
Oh, that was historically true, there's no doubt about it. But the way I think we have to make sure, and to me, the core of the Fair Housing Act is anybody who can afford to buy or rent must be allowed, based on their income, to do that. That, to me, is the core of the Fair Housing Act.
This, in part, gets back to the question of what is the core of the Fair Housing Act.
Right,
Some people would say that the core of the Fair Housing Act is simply to prevent discrimination. Others believe that core to the Fair Housing Act is implicit that we focus also on integration.
I think there's a dual mandate for the act that is often ignored, and that there is a focus on the anti-discrimination principles, which is more at the individual level, kind of preventing discrimination in individual transactions. But the integration mandate of the Fair Housing Act is one that has often got left behind or ignored or rendered invisible through some of the work that's been done. And it's a very crucial mandate that requires kind of a different kind of structural, a look at the structural things that are preventing communities from true integration. And the one thing I want to add is we have to remember the Fair Housing Act obviously was seeking to address and remedy deep racial segregation in housing, but it also was an important tool for addressing the barriers for people with disabilities, for women, for people who didn't fit the traditional familial status, people of like gay and lesbian families and the like. And so when I was at DOJ, the highest volume of cases that we were seeing were from the disability, barriers on disability. So I just want to add that the integration mandate is one that is actually, it's a broad mandate.
Yeah, Dave.
Wow, how much time we have? And so, I would just say, look, if you look at the Department of Labor Savings Statistic Research, the level of inherited wealth in white non-Hispanic families is higher because of generational advantage. And this is an economic discussion. I'm not trying to make the social policy discussion, but we've disenfranchised minority communities for decades in this country, and I think it's going to take affirmative efforts to try to create opportunity. I think that raises the economy. And to your point, there's no separate but equal. We've proved that in education. We've proved that in other areas where there's good research. You have to create opportunities to.
Did I say separate but equal?
No, you didn't. I worry about what efforts we have going forward in terms of making sure there's available, affordable housing stock, that we look at underwriting the way we underwrite families in America today and recognize that there are differences in diverse communities versus traditional underwriting standards of how families were approved. And you talked about the banks doing more. Almost every bank today doesn't hold their loans anymore. Most of them don't have balance sheet, and the regulators don't like them to hold their mortgages. So they sell them to Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae or get them insured by FHA and sell them in mortgage securities around the country. And those rules are established by the regulators involved. Mm-hmm. And you make a very good point. You don't want to go so far as you create another wrath of failure, which we saw in communities like Detroit and others that were so concentrated with the housing collapse in terms of adverse outcome to minority communities. But at the same time, I think we collectively can't use that as an excuse to not say, hey, we got a real problem here. We need to look at the demographics that are shaping America today. This millennial generation is not white. It's 2/3 are minority, and our economy depends on thinking differently about how we move forward. And I think that has to do with how Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac underwrites credit. I think it's how we focus our efforts on monies being used in communities to build the right kind of housing stock. All of these have to come down to local policies, but to your point, I think it does start at the federal level. And it's going to take a concentrated effort to help identify the areas, which is why I keep going back to the fact I think this is a crisis. And I think we need to focus on, have this established that way by the president to focus on this area. I've called for this for years, that we need someone who focuses solely on this issue at the federal level, reporting to a president who has teeth. And I just don't think we have that effort in a way today, and it's getting worse. Housing is getting more expensive and the gap's getting wider. So it's an area we need to focus on.
I want to respond to that, but also go back to the point about the dual mandate of integration. I think that is the dual mandate, but we have to think deeply about what makes integration happen and be sustained. And so affirmatively furthering fair housing focused a lot on, for instance, where it was implemented to its greatest extent in Westchester County, New York, under a court order, on let's build affordable, which means subsidized rental housing for the most part, in affluent areas. Sounds good. It's not a way for renters to establish and build wealth because they don't own anything. I think we are better off focusing on zoning change at the local level. I think we all understand that one of the reasons we have a housing crisis, why is there such a housing crisis in a rich place like San Jose, California? Because 70% of the community is zoned for single-family homes. Not everybody wants a single-family home anymore. We have diverse buyers. We have, at the same time, the hardest thing to convince affluent, suburban, predominantly white, perhaps, communities is that they should accept subsidized housing, people who are much poorer than they are. That's the hardest thing.
Right. I want to stop you for 1 second and let the audience know that we will be coming to you for questions in just a moment. So if you can start thinking about them now, condensing them all the way down, making sure that they are questions rather than comments, I would greatly appreciate it. And you can raise those hands high. There are mic runners in the audience.
I just wanted to quote the Dean of American Sociologists, Herbert Gans of Columbia, who has written, "Experience with residential integration in many communities indicates that it can be achieved without problems." Herb Gans is not a conservative, by the way. "It can be achieved without problems when the two races are similar in socioeconomic level." I think that is really important to keep. How do we sustain integration and minimize any tension? Do I wish that we didn't have to reassure white people? I do wish that, but that is a reality. That's what we've had over the many years. And I think what we need to do is to open up zoning, convince these communities, you need more two-family homes. You need more three-family homes so that people of more modest means can live in your community. That's different than saying, let's build a 12-story public housing project. They're not going to go for that. We just saw in California, liberal California, a housing bill to override local zoning to build mid-rise construction near transit-oriented development, voted down by the General Assembly
I think
in California.
I want to let Vanita and Dave respond very, very quickly, and then we're going to go to the audience.
I would just say it shouldn't be an either-or proposition. I think that with, there are multiple taxes that need to be deployed, and there is a role absolutely on the local side on these local zoning ordinances where local governments actually do have a particular role to play in furthering fair housing. So to me, it doesn't remove the responsibility of the federal government to really seek to enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act in the way that it's meant to, and some of that requires having those kinds of goals to do so.
Quick response.
Look, after in 2009, Secretary Donovan took a group of us down to New Orleans because it was the response to the hurricane. And I visited parish after parish, and I saw the hardest hit parishes, the ones that had nothing left on their land, and those were heavily concentrated with minorities. And I just think money needs to have a more aggressive way of flowing to communities. And in the end of the day, you're talking about the Westchester County case as an example. If you can go to Larchmont High School, you're going to end up with a better education. And so, all of this sort of trickles downstream. It's a big problem, and you can't solve it in 25 minutes on stage. But I do think it's an area that we need to have an alignment around. This needs focus. It needs to be prioritized by the president, and people need to start calling for it, not just at a 50th anniversary event. We need to start talking about it publicly, that this is too important for the U.S. economy, because in the end of the day, as we look forward and we look at the diversity of the generations that are going to be running this country, you have to create opportunity, or our economy is not going to be what we want it to be. And so it's an economic discussion more than as much as it is a sociological one.
10 seconds. But
we're actually going to, we need to go to the
education can't be
audience.
reserved for a fortunate few.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, that's right.
Thank you. Good morning, Antoine Thompson, Executive Director, National Association of Real Estate Brokers, oldest black real estate association in the country. I just wanted to say a couple quick things. One is two questions. First is for the panel. If you all could shed some light on America's historical role in providing access to land for white Americans for hundreds of years through the Homestead Act, through land dispositions agreements for developers and LDAs and things like that, and the risk that we often allow for whites to be successful and unsuccessful, and we're a little more critical when African Americans are not. The other thing I would say is that out of the Great Depression, which David, I think, was getting at, is a lot of programs came into existence to help create suburban America, as we know from books like Crabgrass Frontier and others, that this was orchestrated, the homeowners, suburbia was created by the federal government. And when we look 50, 70 years later, you know, now we have this massive home ownership gap. What do you all say about that?
Okay.
And how do we fix it? Because we're trying to create 2 million new black homeowners.
We want to make sure that we get other questions in, so could just one person answer the historical question?
So, I mean, look, FHA was created in 1934 to offer Title I loans to rural communities and to farmers and ranchers. So I think that's right. I mean, to your point, Antoine, I think, and you know, great role NARAB can play as we move forward in this dialogue, but the reality is that we do have decades of disparities, and it's not a matter of fault, it's just a matter of reality, and we need to be thinking about public policies that help create opportunity for those that have been neglected in the past, and if that's the point.
Oh, no, yeah. She wants to get another question. I will keep myself muzzled.
Hi, John Lewis with Fannie Mae. My question is, do you think technology and innovation has an opportunity to be an equalizer in this field?
So, so let me, maybe focusing on the wrong thing, but we should talk about this because I think right now we have to also address that the venues for accessing housing and ads and where ads are placed is all playing itself out online in a really big way that I think Facebook, now I can't remember what the percentage of housing ads that are actually like being placed at Facebook right now in terms of really owning the market around some of these issues. And there's been a very long, a pretty rich concern about Facebook's own ways that they're engaging in racial discrimination to prevent certain people from being able, giving hosts actually the ability to click on who's going to receive which ads and the like, and being able to prevent that. So that's the negative side of the kind of changing nature of where housing and housing access is playing itself out. And so I think that that's a huge area that we have to focus on. The Leadership Conference has been long engaged with a process with Airbnb and now with Facebook to really address this problem, because unless we're pretty intentional about it, there's a whole economy taking place that has so far been relatively untouched by the Fair Housing Act, and that will become a huge loophole that will have huge consequences on our economy.
Yeah, I'd like to see, in New York, we did a paper that showed that there's a good deal of what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. Housing in the private market that was as affordable as subsidized housing or low-income housing, but people don't know about it. And so I think that city governments can work with Street Easy and Zillow and organizations like this to say, you may not know that there's a house or an apartment you can afford, but there is. And I think that technology could be a reach-out mechanism in that kind of way.
I know we could talk about this all day, but please join me in thanking our panel.
For a session produced by our underwriter, please welcome Carlos Campbell, former Assistant Secretary for Economic Development at the Department of Commerce and a key witness for the Fair Housing Act, and Jeffrey Hayward, Executive Vice President and Head of Multifamily at Fannie Mae.
Well, I'm just delighted to be here today and have an opportunity to have you all see me ask Carlos Campbell a couple of questions. What I think about most when I think about the work that you've done is that leadership really does make a difference. And I'm thrilled that every day I get to work at a company where through housing we get our opportunity and our duty to lead is there. So Carlos, I'm going to ask you my first question here, which is, you know, I look at all of the work you've done as being terrific work, but there are three seminal moments that really stick in my mind. And so I'm going to ask you the first one, which is when you got home from duty, you're off looking for an apartment. What happened and what inspired you to not just take it, but go and do something different?
Well, thanks for that question and thanks for this opportunity. A couple of things happened. I had been flying in the reconnaissance business, which was a very dangerous business. We were dancing around the Soviet airspaces. I won't say we deliberately violated their airspaces, but we're collecting intelligence. And when you're in that business, you've got MiGs on top of you, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you know that your butt is on the line, because during the Cold War, we lost over 500 aviators in that business. You feel like you stepped up when you were called. You come back to the United States, you're married with a baby, and you're looking for housing. And my options were open. I could have had an apartment, a townhouse, or single family. I'm looking around, and I'm being rejected in uniform. I went to a place called Americana Fairfax, owned by Carl Freeman, and I walked into the lobby, and here is a South Vietnamese Army officer checking his mail. So I said, wow, I had pay dirt. I walk up to get an application, and a woman looks at me with impunity, and she says, I'm sorry, we don't practice open occupancy. So that kind of blew me away. And I eventually got a place, but there were several things that drove me to persist in the right letters and to try to get some of the policies reversed. And because of the help of an attorney like Phil Hirschkopf, who won the Loving case, and a good support system, including my father, who was a close friend of the administrator, Robert Weaver, we were able to get some traction and get some things turned around. I want to point out also, once I moved into the area near Mount Vernon, off the Memorial Parkway, the place where we lived immediately, the people could not have been nicer. But when I go out in the morning, because I was still on flight status, to do my morning run at the crack of dawn, the police would stop me. And they would say, somebody reported a suspicious person in the neighborhood. And I said, well, if I find anybody that looks suspicious, I'll let you know. You know? And I said, I'm Lieutenant Campbell. I'm at the Defense Intelligence Agency. So that, and then the other thing is that the community of African American aviators in the Navy was a very small and close-knit community. And we lost one of our superstars, Joe Henriquez, and when his wife called me to tell me what had happened, I rushed over to the house in Southeast to try to console her. And another friend, Ben Cloud, he was a fighter pilot, he came over, and so we consoled her, and we walked out to leave, and his kid came up to the passenger side of the car, and he said, Mr. Campbell, why did my father die? And I couldn't answer that. I've never answered that question. So when Carol received the flag at Arlington, she was 8.5 months pregnant. And I looked at her face, and it was in Ebony magazine, the funeral. And I said, she could not walk out of that cemetery and buy or rent a house without any hassle. And that just really kind of like drove me to the edge. So I couldn't let this rest. So when I had to move 2 years later, I thought if I could get a place at the River House right next to the Pentagon, I could at least stop off and have dinner with my family, because I was going to graduate school at night. And I walked into the lobby again. I'm told with impunity. Now this is before we had the act passed. I'm sorry, sir, we don't practice open occupancy. So I wrote a letter to Secretary of Defense McNamara, one-page letter asking him to desegregate the River House, which was 1,661 units, and I said it would be inappropriate to do any business with the Cafritz Company unless they capitulate. And he called in the Cafritz people, well, not he, but the Assistant Secretary, Jack Moskowitz, and they decided to capitulate. And so, all total, with just a few letters and a lot of support, you know, from people that had their hearts and heads in the right place, we got several thousand units desegregated. But I was driven because of the hostility. The hair salon on Fort Hunt Road wouldn't do my wife's hair, and the woman, you know, refused, and my wife would not leave. The woman called the police, and the police said, you have to do Mrs. Campbell's hair because there's a Public Accommodations Act. The policeman, the white policeman, knew the 64th, you know, Civil Rights Act. My daughter, they wouldn't let her wade in the water at a private pool, and they shut the power off. But we got through all of that stuff. But that's what the environment was like in that.
Now, fast forward a little bit. Right before the act, you testified in front of Congress. You were still in the Navy. Right. And talk about kind of what your superior officers thought about that, and kind of what sacrifice you had to make to go and be able to testify?
Let me put this in context. After the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, Dr. King came up to Michigan State University, and he spoke with Reverend Ralph David Abernathy. And he said he told the people who were demonstrating and marching, they had a choice between riding in humiliation or walking in dignity. So I remembered that. And so that was one of my personal drivers. The other thing is that I worked for a very interesting admiral from Georgia, Admiral Steve Morrison. His son was Jim Morrison of the Doors. And Admiral Morrison told me in no uncertain terms he did not want me using my position as a naval officer to advance civil rights. So I said, you're talking to the wrong guy. So normally I wouldn't wear my whites, in the summertime. And so I put on my whites with my little bitty gold wings and went up and testified in front of the committee and told Senator Mondale my story, what I had to deal with. But it wasn't about Carlos Campbell. It was about Ben Cloud and his resistance. It was about Bill Norman and the resistance he ran into. It was about Frank Peterson. We all had to adapt, and it was just not the Washington area. When you traveled across country and you didn't know where you slept in your car just because you're black. You didn't know what hotel was segregated, and I didn't want to stay in any segregated places. So those were the kind of things that drove me.
So fast forward, you go, the act is passed, thank God, and you're working at HUD under George Romney as secretary.
Right.
Talk about what kind of environment that was like, and what fueled you to try to get some things done once you arrived there.
Well, excuse me, I worked for a very progressive and committed Assistant Secretary, Samuel C. Jackson, from Kansas, from Topeka. And he was a Republican. I had no affiliation at all, but he convinced me to come and work for him. And he was determined to be very aggressive and turning the place around, as he used to say. And Secretary Romney from Michigan had been the neighbor of my first boss out of Michigan State, Dr. John Snell. So I had sort of like a side channel to the secretary, who was totally committed. And he tried to use the law to integrate various communities, the most famous of which was Warren, Michigan. And he had John Mitchell on board, the AG, the Attorney General. But the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, he came out with this term. He said he did not like the idea of forced integration. Nobody's talking about forced integration. We're talking about the law of the land. You take an oath, defend the Constitution, all the laws, etc. But the president, so I was out of HUD. HUD was it was an agency in transition. I'm not going to say it was a racist agency, but culturally, it was a racist agency. Okay? HUD built the ghettos of America. And I have been in, my ex-wife now, she grew up in public housing. And I know a lot of great people, physicians, attorneys, that came out of public housing. So the housing itself.
Just so you know,
I know
I came out of public housing.
I'm setting you up, bro. I know that. And I think because of that experience, you have the empathy of what you need to turn the whole system around. HUD, I'm looking at the regulations, and they talked about in the FHA regs maintaining neighborhood stability, which no black folk, okay? And so it's an education. But I'm convinced that Secretary Romney was probably, and I knew about half of the secretaries over the years. I worked with Jack Kemp was a good friend, Jim Lynn, we were on a federal city council together. And, excuse me. So, I'm sorry. Everybody wanted to do the right thing, but very few people did. Secretary Romney, I think, went way out, went as far as he could go. and I respect his legacy. But the rank and file people, they were committed to the status quo. And HUD is a tough bureaucracy. And let me say this, I've been in Washington a few years. There's a force in this town, they're called lobbyists. There are over 10,000, they generate over $6 billion a year in revenues. And I was correctly quoted once because I said, at its worst, government is about deception and power is about abuse. And you don't see change in the demographic pattern because the desire for the change is not there. There are not enough black people in the United States to scare all the white people that are scared. We don't have enough black folk to scare each other, okay? So I don't get it. I've never quite understood the resistance to change. A lot of people move into communities because they don't want to raise their children in a segregated environment. They want diverse communities, but you look at the resistance.
So let me ask you a question about leadership and going forward. So what you did, at least in my view, and I think in the view of many folks, is that you, at the moments where you could make a difference, you took that opportunity to do so. If you're advising us who we're housing practitioners, this is the work we do every day, how would you advise us as leaders to make more progress and to really live up to what the Fair Housing Act aspired to do?
Well, I'm going to have to put my hat on as an aviator. First thing you do when you go into a target is you want to know what the resistance is. What are the countermeasures you're going to need? And a lot of the great leadership challenge comes from Edmund Burke. You know, all it takes for the triumph of good over evil is for good men to do nothing. And you have to commit yourself. And I come from a family of a lot of ministers, and in Micah it says, we're here to pursue justice, embrace mercy, and walk humbly. And two of those I got right. So in the Navy, you are taught that the first principle of leadership is setting the example. And what you do, for example, you obviously have a well-earned, outstanding reputation, which is the case with, you know, Fannie Mae. And every day you have to be challenged. The great psychoanalyst, Erik Erikson, said, without a challenge, you regress. And so you challenge yourself every day. And life is a lot different. If you wake up in the morning and you say, what is my challenge today? And the challenge may be to hire 2 or 3 people, or to make sure that the system is not clogged up so applications get through, and to make the world a better place. So you feel like, I think King wrote his dissertation on Tillich. He said the great anxieties of life are death, guilt, and meaningfulness. How can you become meaningful? What challenges do you want to take on? And I mean, if people did 1/10 of what you're doing, the world would be a better place.
Well, I'm actually going to stop us there.
Okay.
Why not?
Well, that's what you wrote. That's what you did. You said us what to say.
And say thank you very much, Carlos,
thank you, sir.
for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Up next, for a conversation on national challenges and local solutions, please welcome Rob Braymeyer, Executive Director of the Oak Park Regional Housing Center, and Maria Torres Springer, Commissioner of New York City's Department of Housing and Preservation and Development. Back to lead the conversation, The Atlantic's Jillian White.
So I think thus far we've been able to talk about the Fair Housing Act kind of at the bird's eye view, and then also we've had personal stories. I want you to discuss a little bit about your role in thinking about fair housing and then implementing that in your cities. Maria, you want to start?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So I'm the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Our work is to advance the housing plan in New York, where we've set really ambitious goals to build and preserve affordable housing. It's about 300,000 homes through 2026. And really the work that we do in the agency, together with many different sister agencies, reflects in many ways what the story is of New York. And so on one hand, it's a story, and continues to be one, of growth, all-time population high, all-time high in terms of jobs, continues to be a city that has an embarrassment of riches in terms of cultural institutions, et cetera. But of course, it's also a story of too many inequities, of incredible rent burden, for instance, on the part of too many New Yorkers. And it's a story that reflects the story of many cities across this country, shaped by a history, legacy, decades of inequities and discrimination. And so as we, 50 years, and it's been spoken a lot about today after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, we believe that our work has to be not just about reflecting on that history, the good and the bad, but really about taking it as far as we can, advancing the work as far as we can in order to create inclusive communities, to promote choice, to make sure that we're really increasing access to opportunity for New Yorkers. And it's grounded really in a balanced approach in making sure that we're doing, from a housing policy perspective, all of the things that we need to do in order both to give people the ability to reach a little bit higher, to access opportunities in neighborhoods across the city. We do that through a number of programs, changes in zoning that ensure that we have affordable housing in higher income neighborhoods, while at the same time looking at place-based initiatives where we're building affordable housing, but pairing that with investments in infrastructure, in parks, in schools, and a lot of work to combat displacement. Because part of the choice that we want to make sure exists in New York is the choice to be able to stay and live and thrive in neighborhoods that New Yorkers have really built. And they were there in good times and in bad times. And so it's really through the combination of those tools that we hope that we don't squander this opportunity that we have to keep furthering this really important but challenging work.
Can you talk a little bit about your work in Oak Park?
Sure. So I run a nonprofit organization that exists in Oak Park, Illinois, and we got started a little over, almost about 50 years ago. And the work that we do is based on a mission to achieve meaningful and lasting racial diversity in the community. And so Oak Park, if you don't know it, is right next to the city of Chicago. We border it directly to the west, and it's about 52,000 people in 4.5 square miles. So it's a moderately dense community. It feels like you're still in the city. The L goes to it. So we had to really make sure that we came up with a plan that, as the city of Chicago changed on the west side from being basically 90% white to 90% black in a very, very quick period, the folks in Oak Park recognized that that was probably going to happen there too. And instead, what we could do is try to figure out a way to embrace integration, so that what that means is that we not only have people from all sorts of diverse backgrounds. At that time, it was mostly about black and white, but today it's about every racial group. And we can build a community where they all live together. In other words, we don't have a segregated part of our community where one group lives and another group lives somewhere else. And that has helped us build a community culture around the idea that this should be a place that's inclusive, that we should be trying to build more equitable structures, and that everyone has a place everyone has a way to become part of our community.
Maria, New York has decided to move ahead with affirmatively furthering fair housing despite the current administration's decision to kind of push that deadline back. I want to talk a little bit about why New York chose to do that, and then also what it means to be doing it despite kind of the lack of a federal push to do that.
Yes, so we, the original deadline for our submission of our assessment of fair housing was 2019. Of course, we learned earlier this year that HUD has chosen to delay the implementation of the rule. We in New York are moving forward because for two main reasons. One is a real recognition on the part of the leaders of the city and the community, and certainly us at HPD, that this work of furthering fair housing, it's certainly a marathon, but what it is, it's a relay. And that we have now, me in my role, I've been given the baton. I'm not going to drop it. And the work takes a long time. And the decision to delay the implementation of the rule, we think is an irresponsible decision that really rolls back a lot of the progress and a lot of the commitment. It is not the time to put the brakes on this work. It doesn't mean that the work is going to be easy. We just launched, as you mentioned, our comprehensive fair housing planning process. We're calling it Where We Live NYC. It will be 2 years of not just policy analysis, but really engagement with the community. Because part of what I think really needs to be central to this work, as it has been in so many communities, but for us in New York, it's of course a very different context. The neighborhoods in New York are very different from each other and very different from neighborhoods across the country. We need to engage real human beings in what it means for them to live where they live, what that means in terms of access to opportunity, and what they want and what they believe needs to be done given that experience, not just by local government, local, state, and federal government, in order for us to make sure we actually have, as much as we can, diverse and livable neighborhoods. And so we're moving full steam ahead with that work. We've already launched the engagement process. And at the end of the process in 2019, the original deadline, our commitment is to make sure that we will not have just run a robust and meaningful process, but we will have recommitted ourselves to very specific goals, very specific strategies to continue this work. As I mentioned, we have a balanced approach right now. It doesn't mean we have all the answers, but it's critical to us that we are really engaging our citizens and are as aggressive as possible in the furthering of the work.
Rob, you talked a little bit about the goal of sustained integration and how it requires being proactive versus reactive, which I think is what ends up happening in a lot of communities. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you think about being proactive, and then also what those conversations actually look like on the ground?
Right, yeah. So this is really the genius of what we created. So when Oak Park started this work and the Housing Center was created, the community was 99% white. We knew that change was going to happen, and we knew that we needed to embrace that change in a way that was going to be beneficial for the community, as well as the new people who were moving into the community. And so what we decided to do is, instead of come up with the typical only have an enforcement mechanism, right? So we do have enforcement mechanisms. If people are discriminated against, there's a way to go about making that complaint and remedying the situation. But what we do in addition to that, and the Housing Center is critical to this, is we engage people when they're searching for housing. And so at the beginning of our time, we did it both in the home ownership and the rental market. Now we basically have trained our real estate agents in the community to take on the home ownership part for us, and we just do the rental side. So so for in that rental situation, Oak Park, even though it's a sort of middle class, upper middle class community, it's 45% rental as well. So we have a lot of rental apartments to work with. When people want to move to the community, they can come to us and they can talk to us about what they're looking for. All the landlords in the community work with us too. They give us all their listings and they tell us what's available and they tell us all about the apartment. So it's almost like we know exactly what's happening in that apartment. So we can connect people really quickly. We can get them exactly what they're looking for, what they can afford, and put that together. In that process, though, what we have to do is deal with implicit bias, and what the research shows is something kind of like a racial blind spot, where even today, 45 to 50 years after we started this process, people still move to Oak Park, and when they first move, they have this idea that it's a diverse place, but because most places in America that are diverse are segregated, they assume Oak Park will be segregated as well. And so their race defines where they think they belong in Oak Park and where they should avoid, and that is constantly happening to us. So we have people who are helping them, right? We don't just say, here's your listings and on your way, thank you very much. We actually talk to them for a half an hour or so, and work through this process with them and hear what those reservations are and hesitations are, and we get to learn about where they're trying to avoid and those sorts of things, and we can talk them through actually looking into those parts of Oak Park as well. So this is almost always racially based, and it has a lot to do with the fact that we're surrounded by more monoracial and segregated places. The neighborhood in Chicago that's on our east is 90% African American. There's a community on our west that's 85% white. There's 2 communities to our south that are 60 to 90% Latino. And so everyone thinks, well, we must have that pattern within Oak Park as well, and that's not the case. So we can talk that through, and we can explain that to them. And their initial hesitation and or just ignorance of the parts of Oak Park that they were sort of avoiding goes away. And we can actually add to the number of options that they would have thought about in the first place and get them to think about moving in a way that would sustain our integration or improve it, because we're always trying to improve it. We're looking to figure out ways to help people think about that all the time. Just really quickly, if we do that, we know that about 68% of the time, they'll make a move that'll either sustain or improve our integration. So it keeps it going, it keeps improving. If they don't use us, and we know this partly from the data of when an owner rents to somebody that we didn't provide to them and they let us know the unit's been closed out, it happens less than 50% of the time. So if it's under 50% of the time, segregation continues. So we have to sort of have this intentional mechanism in place in order to keep this going.
So before I ask you guys a few more questions, I do want to let the audience know that once again we'll be coming to you for questions. So start thinking about them now. You've all already heard my spiel. Condense them down, make sure they're questions, and you can get your hands up, and we have mic runners in the audience. I want to talk about the issue of affordability a little because it feels like we'd be remiss to leave that out. There's just a ton of debate out there about what affordable housing that works actually looks like, both in sustaining actual affordability and in integrating communities. I'm wondering how you guys are thinking about that as you move forward and what you think the most successful models are.
Yeah. So what we're pursuing in New York, and of course, like with many cities, the affordability crisis is quite dire. We've been in a housing emergency for 3 decades. It continues. 30% of our renters are severely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And so we have, as I mentioned earlier, what we believe to be the most ambitious plan to create and preserve affordable housing. I get asked all the time, affordable for whom? What does that really look like? So the plan is intended to meet the needs of a wide variety of families from different income levels, because the need is really dire, not just for extremely low-income families, but for working class people in New York City, the firefighters, the nurses, the teachers who built the city and feel like they're losing their grip on it. So that thus far, 1/3 of the units the homes that we've produced, it's about 88,000 so far, are for people who are extremely low and very low income families. In the last year, it's actually close to 50%. So we certainly understand that we have to provide the types of homes for those who are most rent burdened. There's a big piece of this, given the commitment to fair housing, that's making sure that the homes are built in all of the neighborhoods in New York. And so there are places where we have land or where land costs are reasonable enough such that those are the projects that get assembled by our development partners, and we provide subsidy and we build affordable housing there. But one of the key policy initiatives of the de Blasio administration, which we really believe will pay dividends into the future, is our new mandatory inclusionary housing policy. So now, anywhere in the city that is zoned for new residential growth, you have to provide affordable housing, 20 to 25% permanently affordable housing. This is anywhere in the city. And of course, this means that we're able to get affordable housing in higher income neighborhoods. So that it's a key policy. It pairs with all of the work that is happening in other neighborhoods of the city. And an important part of this is where we're building in lower income neighborhoods, it's not just the housing, because I think a big part of this work is understanding that we have to connect the dots between housing and health and jobs and safety and parks. And the last thing I'll say because the affordability crisis in New York is of a particular type, there is a lot of work on anti-displacement that we've really been focusing on, providing, for example, free lawyers if you're a low-income resident in housing court, ensuring that we're combating harassment against landlords who are using unsavory practices. And so all of those tools come together. It's not, it can't work everywhere. I'm sure there are things that we still need to do in New York, but those are the main levers that we're pulling.
Rob, can you talk a
So
little bit?
the affordable housing issue in Oak Park is something that's a more recent phenomenon. Over the last 10 years, for sure, it's definitely become something that's much more top of mind of residents in the community. And the reason for that is again, going back to our racial integration strategy, that actually is a situation in which as we became less white and more diverse and more integrated, we started to see our property values go up. So, and they went up at a fairly rapid rate. And it's because we were creating a community that there was much more demand for than we had supply of. So in other words, there are a lot more people who want to live in a place like Oak Park than there are Oak Parks in the world. And there certainly are no other Oak Parks really. There's a couple other communities in the whole Chicago region that are much smaller than Oak Park. They're only like 10,000 to 12,000 people. So there's not a whole lot of opportunity for people to find a community like Oak Park. So we have way more demand than we have the supply to deal with. And what that means is our property values went way up. And that created some affordability issues. We've put into place, though, a lot of things actually very similar to New York City in this case, as far as the folks who we're dealing with as far as feeling the displacement pressures are folks that are really like working class to lower middle class folks, right? People who make between $40,000 a year and $80,000 a year because they're not going to get any sort of subsidies or other help that we have in our affordable housing toolbox that really starts at the federal government and works its way down. And of course, people above those incomes are able to afford to live in the community. So what we have to do is figure out how can we do some things that will help those folks in that middle. We actually have our own housing authority, even though it's only 4.5 square miles. That housing authority has 520 voucher holders, which is about 6% of our rental market. And that's a really, really high number for a middle class community. It's usually like under 1%. So we have these mechanisms that we put in place for like the very low income folks in the community. But to try to figure out what we're going to do around middle income is much harder because there aren't really federal ways to fund that. You have to come up with local and private ways to do that. And it's a bigger challenge than even the lowest income affordable housing issues.
All right, we want to go to the audience right over there.
Hi, Linda White, independent researcher, Washington, D.C. So we keep hearing that integrated neighborhoods are better neighborhoods. Now, I'm an integrationist, but we've had a lot of all-black communities that have thrived, such as right here in Washington, Deanwood, Kingman Park, River Terrace. But in some locations, historically, the black towns have been destroyed with the support of the U.S. government. And Secretary Campbell said that even the government built the ghettos. So my question is, since the federal government is so responsible for the inequity in housing, what do you think is the case for reparations for housing?
All right. Does one of you want to take that?
I'll try. So first I'll say that yes, integrated neighborhoods are a really great thing, but they're not the only thing, right? We're not trying to say that like every neighborhood has to look exactly like every other neighborhood. There can be variations on what integration looks like and what that sort of thing, and there of course can be I think we all feel a lot more comfortable in the sort of civil rights field about a neighborhood that is majority black and we're figuring out how to make that thrive versus a neighborhood that's majority white. That's always happened, right? So it doesn't feel as hefty of a lift. And it doesn't feel like there's a big win in the civil rights arena. But whether it's integrated or not, what we need to figure out is not only are we bringing people together and helping them live among one another, but are we putting the structures in place that will make sure that we all get the full benefit of that too, right? So even in Oak Park, after 50 years, we're still working on that. It's not a utopia. We're working very hard to continue to improve on our strategy. But in most of America, if you have segregation, you also have two separate entities altogether. and you have way different levels of resources, way different levels of opportunity, way different levels of power and influence. And that really sets us up for disaster, essentially. And it doesn't hurt only the people in the communities that don't have all the resources and don't have, it hurts us all, because we end up paying for these even bigger structural things that cost much, much more money and create much, much more disharmony and pain than working together to figure out how to build that back. So reparations, in my point of view, there's two ways to look at that. One is, can we do that because that's actually like not only a moral victory, but it's an economic victory for the country. We'll actually start to make things work out better. But we can do this through integration too, by trying to share and leverage the privilege that white people have and bring other people into that community so they can take advantage of what's sort of natural for white people and make it natural for everybody.
All right, I think reparations is where we're going to end it today. Please join me in thanking our panel.
And now for a conversation on measuring the ripple effects, please welcome Cheryl Cashin, Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown Law; Allison Silberberg, Mayor of Alexandria, Virginia; and Sherilyn Eiffel, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. To lead the conversation, please welcome back the Atlantic's Van Newkirk.
So we get to sort of wrap up our conversation on housing equity, what it means, what segregation means. And what I want to talk about in this panel is sort of what we really mean and what the real effects are of housing segregation and inequity and also equity. So I want to start by asking everybody on the panel one question, and that's, when we talk about housing equity, what are we really talking about? We can start down, Cheryl.
Well, today, 2/3 of African Americans live in what would be described low opportunity settings. 40% of black children live in very low opportunity settings, and they don't have much in the way of economic mobility because they're living in a place where there's tends to be disinvestment. Majority of black kids are in segregated schools, and what we have in this country is what I call opportunity hoarding. Direct horizontal competition between high opportunity, medium, and low opportunity places, and we tend to disinvest, over-police. We have a lot of black kids in schools where, no one says this out loud, but they say, let's disinvest in these schools, give them the weakest teachers, often teachers who aren't certified to teach what they have. And so everywhere you turn, if you're in a low opportunity setting, you are constrained in terms of access to jobs, access to education, access to networks. So that's what I mean by housing inequity.
We put a lot of this on black students, especially. We say the way out is to get a good education and to get through all these things. But you're saying, this is the end result. Right.
Well, the combination of segregated housing and segregated schooling, we have ordered ourselves in a way, particularly where schooling is not an engine of opportunity, it's an engine of a caste system in this country. We like to believe these shibboleths about America, but America has rising socioeconomic inequality, and we haven't ordered our society in a way that lives up to our values.
So, Mayor Silberberg, I want to follow up on that with you. When we are talking about housing equity, especially in the context of Alexandria, what are we talking about? And what does it mean to your office and your policy?
Well, affordable housing, is this on? Can you hear me? Affordable housing is a top priority in Alexandria, and we're very lucky because it's a core value of the city. In fact, we're right now discussing how to increase dedicated funding for the Affordable Housing Fund, which has existed for some 15 years. We just opened up a new building for about 93 affordable housing units, and the building is stunning. And it was created by a nonprofit developer in partnership with the city of Alexandria. And if you drive by the building, you don't drive by and say, oh, there's the affordable housing building. That's not what I want for our city. We must have a place that is noble, really, and is appropriate, that you can't drive by and say, there's the affordable housing building. That's not right. And so we're really committed to doing all we can for this crucial issue. It's a crisis, really, for the country. And in terms of equity, you see, it's really about fairness, that people need housing. And for those 93 units, some 2,000 signed up. In the past 20 years, we've lost something like 90% of our market rate affordable housing units in our city. So over 12 or 14,000 market rate affordable housing units because of redevelopment. So what we're doing now is we're really reaching out, and I've really been committed to this for quite a while. We're partnering with nonprofit developers. We can take funds from that affordable housing fund, which I want to increase, and it's sort of like a lockbox. And that's what other cities need too, I hope. And so that was created so long ago, 15 years ago. And so now the community embraces it. As far as education, I mean, clearly, though the Fair Housing Act was signed into law in late 60s, we're still feeling the effects. We still are feeling the legacy of segregation in this country. But we have an ability to right that wrong. And it has taken a long time. It is a shame. It's a dark chapter of our country. But now, I think as a country, we are moving forward. And in the city of Alexandria, I'm fully committed to, and I think the council that I serve with is committed to it as well. But mainly it's the community. And where the community kind of has a little bit of friction, I think, with some of these redevelopments, is making sure that those buildings understandably fit in to the community architecturally, or that it doesn't, overwhelm in height and density, that it fits in. And so you can you can do things architecturally, like making sure that it looks similar to the architecture around there, making sure that there's a setback at the very top so that, again, it doesn't seem as high. And, that affordable housing building that I was mentioning to you, Van, in the green room was, it has 40% AMI, 50%, 60% AMI, but it's all affordable housing. And then what's going to come right across the way from this building, and I mean like 50 feet away, nothing, is a building that's a market rate building. And there are shared amenities. So, anyway.
Sherilyn, I wanted to follow up with you. I've been following your work, been following the work of your organization for a while, and it seems that fair housing, or housing equity and housing inequity, are sort of at the root of a lot of what you do. So what are we really talking about when we talk about it?
I think we're talking about two things, Van, and I want to go back to Cheryl's original comments about segregation. So we're talking about segregation and we're talking about this history, but I just want to put it just in context for a second in terms of thinking about this as an investment. So, you heard the earlier panels and the history of kind of the role of the federal government in creating segregated America, this kind of massive investment in creating segregated public housing and requiring racially restrictive covenants for, to provide mortgage insurance and redlining and so forth. But what that represents is a kind of massive investment in creating the landscape of America that we now see and that we now accept as though it's inevitable, right? If you think even just about the investment in the interstate highway system, which made the white suburbs possible, $25 billion invested in that's $230 billion in today's money, right, in just the interstate highway. That's a massive investment. If you think about all of these massive investments that went into creating the landscape, the physical landscape that essentially expresses the racism of the early 20th century, right? We get to 1968, we pass the Fair Housing Act, by the way, by one vote, a week after Martin Luther King is assassinated, right? It's passed in shame by one vote, right? So it's not like there's this wellspring of, desire to break down segregation, right? There's blood on that Fair Housing Act, right? So we get there, and now it's 1968, and how do you respond to the investment I just talked about? Well, you file lawsuits against active discrimination. You sue Donald Trump and his dad for not renting to black people, right? You do that. You create some of the measures that we've talked about, but you don't do a commensurate investment that balances the investment that was expended to create the landscape that really made this kind of segregated America. And we still to this day have not met the investment that is required. And so the first thing is to think about what would it mean if we wanted to invest in truly desegregating America, if the federal government wanted to really put its money where its mouth is. And I think there are a number of measures that can be done. There are some that are being executed, some that are being rolled back now, and we're pushing back against them, but there's the issue of segregation. The second thing I would say is that we can't look at housing separate from everything else. That housing actually is connected with almost every other issue that we're talking about. Cheryl talked about housing and education, right? If we didn't have segregated housing, we wouldn't have segregated schools, right? So we know that those two things are intrinsically connected. We know how that happened. We know that the Supreme Court reinforced it in 1973 with two cases, one San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, when the court endorsed the idea that you could use property taxes to fund schools, and two Milliken versus Bradley, when the Supreme Court said that you could not require inter-district busing to deal with segregation. So it meant that if you wanted to engage in white flight, you could get away from busing, right? So we understand that. But what about transportation? Right? Mobility, the ability to move around a community. Once you get out of the large cities in America and you go to places like Baltimore, where we expend a lot of our energy and work, there isn't a rapid transit system that would get the African American community, which lives along the east-west corridor, back and forth and out to the jobs at Johns Hopkins, right? Johns Hopkins, the largest employer probably in the state, to their credit, actually employs ex-offenders. But can you get to the job from West Baltimore? And can you get there on time? Can you get back home to see your kids after school? No, there's no real rapid transportation system in that town. Issues of water. We've all seen what's been happening in Flint. That's about water potability, but there's also about water affordability. And a lot of the work we're doing now is looking at this relationship between water affordability and home ownership and the loss of homes. Water tax liens are becoming one of the highest causes of African Americans being foreclosed on, because they have these water tax liens, and then your house is sold at foreclosure. They're auctioning homes. We just got a moratorium for a year last year in Baltimore on the sale of 1,500 houses. Flint, if you can believe it, regularly raises this issue of foreclosing on homes for water tax liens, and there's not even potable water there. So this question of municipal services and the relationship between that and really having communities of integrity. What does it mean to be a homeowner? What does it mean to have the services that you need to be able to conduct your home? In LaGrange, Georgia, we just filed an amicus brief in a case involving a challenge to the practice in LaGrange, Georgia, of tying municipal services to your payment of court costs and fees. So now we're going to connect it to the justice system. So if you haven't paid your court costs and fees, the municipal utility will turn off your water and your light and so forth. So understanding how all of those threads bear on this question of equity in housing is really important. You cannot consider it alone. You have to connect it to all of the things you need to be able to ensure that you can pay for your home, that your home has the services, that you can get to and from your job, that your children can be educated. And that's why it really lies at the heart of a lot of what we do.
I want to follow up with you, especially about an issue that is on lots of people's minds now, and that's Starbucks. You'll be participating in the next month's the trainings people are doing, and I don't know if people are sort of understanding that there is a housing element to thinking about the Starbucks phenomenon nationwide. Who has access to our increasingly privatized public spaces? who has access to amenities and who's considered to be in-group and out-group when it comes to our justice system. Can you give us maybe a preview of what you're going to be telling folks? But more, what's your sense of how those things are related?
Well, the reason that I agreed to try and help support the effort of Starbucks to do what I think it is their intention to do, which is to really address this issue of racial discrimination, is because this goes, we talked about the Fair Housing Act, but you also have to then add to it the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations. And I think we don't think enough about the reality of that law. First of all, the fact that we needed a Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that today, you know, I'm looking out at this room, we all gathered here and we all came here in ways that would have been very different in 1960, right? Like where you could go and what hotel you stayed at and whatever nice outfit you have on, whether you as an African American could have tried on that outfit in the store that you bought it from, and what restaurant you could eat at, and whether you could eat in the airport a restaurant wherever you came from. And we just move through it now, we just accept it like air. But that had to actually be created. And that too is unfinished work, right? The question of who Black people are in the public space and the ways in which your citizenship and dignity are implicated by your belonging in the public space really lies at the core and heart of the whole struggle around civil rights. And so to see what happened to those young men, and I mean, obviously we've done this work for a very long time. I mean, numerous cases, Denny's and Shoney's, and we sued Abercrombie and Fitch and Wet Seal, and I mean, so you could do it that way, right? But this was an opportunity with a business that I think sincerely wants to try and grapple with this, to think about what if we compelled or expected corporations to take responsibility themselves for the public space. And the public space, by the way, which goes to your question, is not just about what happens inside your store, it's also what happens outside of your store, and how do people interact with this business that exists in 8,000 communities. That when you create a public space, because that's what Starbucks has created, a public space, right? You come in and you're supposed to be able to sit there for a really long time, and you write your paper, and you finish writing your screenplay, and your roommate makes too much noise at college, so you want to finish your paper there, and you have your business meeting there, as these young men were attempting to do. That's a community space, that's a public space. And we have been contesting about the role of Black people, the place of Black people in public space forever. So it implicates all of those questions. And then just lastly, what does it mean when a Starbucks comes to your community? I mean, it means, for an African American community, it probably means a change is coming in your community, right? I was talking about this with my colleague, Janae Nelson, about, what it means when you see the Starbucks, right? And taking responsibility also for that, for who you are in that space.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think I want everybody to queue up their questions in the audience. Cheryl, you talked in your first answer about this chain, this cycle of disinvestment, of how it affects children downstream. It seems to set every generation back a little more. How do you break that chain? How are you conceptualizing breaking that cycle when every single turn of it sets each generation back a little more?
So we have, each time we think that we have put to bed an anti-Black institution, we seem to create a new one, slavery, Jim Crow, ghetto, these are intentional institutions. And the Fair Housing Act had two norms, an anti-discrimination norm and an integration norm, which required the dismantling of segregation. And so, the good news is that there are more than 400 local jurisdictions like yours that are actively promoting integrated housing. The good news is, despite the fact that the Secretary of HUD is trying to delay the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, there are a number of jurisdictions that understand that integration, when it's achieved, actually works. It works. You get higher rates of social mobility for children. You get lower rates of prejudice. You actually create spaces where people interact with each other more based on familiarity than fear, right? And so how you break it, each generation, we have to keep fighting the good fight for this idea, perhaps a utopian idea, that it's possible to have a robust, multiracial, multi-class community that includes rather than excludes, right? But we need constituents to organize. I mean, there's a constituency out there that likes diversity, wants it for their kids in their neighborhood and schools, but the constituency for integration is not organized. Meanwhile, when you try to do things without that organization, NIMBYism, you know, there's still a lot of anti-Black feeling and fear, but it's based on stereotypes people carry in their heads. And I just want to say in response to the Starbucks things, this is not just about Starbucks, right? Everywhere you have a gentrifying neighborhood, I have students who've written about this. It's kind of frightening. When you have in-groups, people who've moved into formerly majority Black and poor spaces without a lot of cultural comfort, what we see is an increase in calls of police, mainly by white people, who are not comfortable, you know, frankly, with a dark-skinned Black man sitting there with, you know, I thought it was a fly hairdo, just like yours, you know, but just a lack of comfort, a lack of, you know, right? The good news is that there's an expanding group of what I call culturally dexterous whites that is getting experience with difference, liking it, and sees it, and actually is getting comfortable with using the R word and saying, that's racism, and I disagree with it. And we just have to keep fighting to create these kinds of integrated spaces, you know. Black folks do have allies. We need more of them.
If I might just add something. And that is, well, since 1990, we've been very proactive about testing with regard to the Fair Housing Act. And we have a great Office of Housing in the city of Alexandria. And I'm really proud of that. Second, I often ask myself, sort of a rhetorical question, of course, what would Dr. King say? What would Dr. King say about what happened in Charlottesville? What would Dr. King say about this conversation? And for my part, in late November 2016, I initiated and wrote, alongside with our Human Rights Commission and Office, a statement on inclusiveness, and the council and I signed it, and it's on a poster all across Alexandria. It's in English, it's very short, it's in English, Spanish, Amharic, and Arabic. And it's really been embraced by the city. It's posted not just in libraries and schools and rec centers and in the city facilities, but also in people's homes and businesses. It's in the city hall for free. And basically what it says is it addresses what we're talking about, which is fairness, inclusiveness, equity. And people want to live in a city that is inclusive. Businesses want to place their workers and run their businesses in such a city. But it's the right thing to do. And I'm very proud of our statement on inclusiveness, and I'm encouraging other jurisdictions to write their own version of it. But basically what it says is that Alexandria is a city of kindness and compassion. And diversity is a core value of our city. And yes, we're tolerant, but we're not just tolerant. We're embracing and accepting. And that we denounce all hate speech and hate crimes and bias and discrimination in all forms. And that everyone has a place at the table regardless of their background, their race, gender, age, disability or ability, religion, immigrant status, on and on. And it's very simple, and yet it's really crucial to create that core foundation. And housing is a part of that. School is a part of that. Jobs, access to transit. In fact, Sherilyn, when you were talking about transit, I totally agree with you. And that's one of the first questions that we as a council look at when we are looking at redeveloping a site. And there's bus rapid transit that's going to be right near that new building that we just did the ribbon cutting for.
Can I just say, one of the reasons why transportation is so important is because we're really operating on dual tracks in terms of the work we're doing at the Legal Defense Fund. Of course, committing to the importance of integrated housing, but we also feel we have a commitment to helping people in African American communities have strong, safe communities of opportunity. And so part of the reason why transportation becomes so important is you ought to be able to live in your African American community and still get to a job, right? That community ought not be isolated. And the reason we work on the water tax lien issue is because we want to make sure that African Americans who do own homes can hold on to their homes, right? So there's two parts of this. And so it's not just about creating integrated communities, but it's also about ensuring that African Americans who live in African American communities have the tools and the opportunity to have those communities be strong, be economically sound, be environmentally sound, have good schools. We really consider it a part of our education work because at the end of the day, the school is surrounded by a community. And the strength of that community determines the strength of that school. So I think we have to be able to keep those two things in our head at once, that people have a right to live in a way that is dignified where they are, and also to work to dismantle the segregated landscape that was created by decades and decades of federal policy.
I want to make sure we have time for one good question back here.
Hello. My name is Barbara Moreland. I'm a volunteer with the Arlington, Virginia Partnership for Affordable Housing. Years ago, when I became aware of commercial affordable housing being offered in our area, I was told that those affordable units would only be restricted to affordable housing for a certain period of time. And I'm interested to know if that's generally true with commercially developed properties that include affordable housing, and if it is, how jurisdictions address the need to continue to have that many or more affordable units in their areas. And third, what happens to a person who's living in an affordable unit that gets transitioned to commercial value?
Could I just? Well, in Alexandria, first of all, we have a housing master plan that talks about a lot of these issues. We also have a one-for-one replacement, that if something's redeveloped, then we need to provide a space for the person who has to leave that site for redevelopment, and we have to find a place for them or give them a voucher if they would choose to go elsewhere. And then finally, it used to be that we required that the developer would only keep the units for, say, 20 or maybe even 25 or maybe 30 years. But now it's 40 or longer years. So I think it was 20 years and now it's 40 or 50 years. So it's just for the asking. And that's what I'd also like to mention. It's really just for the asking. We also, in Alexandria, have a voluntary contribution. When someone's going to redevelop just a regular site, let's say right near somewhere off Jeff Davis Highway or something, then they, frankly, the name is going to be changed, actually. But that's a separate issue. But thank you. We finally got that done after 50 years of conversation. So, it's, that site is, when they're building, let's say, just a commercial property, it has nothing to do with housing. But we ask those developers, we can't require it in Virginia, but we can ask, and we have a standard voluntary contribution formula for asking them to make a significant financial contribution, and that money goes into the Affordable Housing Fund. They can also, alternatively, provide, if they're building with units, let's say, it's housing, then they could provide a few units. Either way, they are participating in this process. Do I think we should get more from them, frankly? Yes.
Thank you so much for that question. And we got one more very quick.
Yes.
Yes.
Bob Woodson. The question that I have for the panel, in fact, the whole day has been on race. The question, as a civil rights veteran myself, why, if we now have 10,000 black elected officials operating in most of these cities, most of the school systems, healthcare systems, juvenile justice, judicial systems are run by black people. The question is, why are our children and our people failing in systems run by our own people? if racism were the issue. Washington, D.C., we lead the nation in per capita expenditures on poverty, and the greatest income disparity is between low-income blacks and upper-income blacks. If racism were the culprit, why aren't all blacks suffering equally?
And that's another conference. Would love to participate. But I'd just say my brief answer is, I mean, I reject out of hand the theory that because you have a black mayor, that means that you now can ameliorate racism, because I just described to you the structural nature of racism and the deep investments. That's the part we don't talk about. We actually don't talk about white supremacy and racism as an investment. And so, to the extent those investments then become embedded, and then you, am I going to get to talk? And then you have things like what I talked about, Supreme Court decisions that aid and abet the kind of movement that happened as a result of people not wanting to attend integrated schools. You're constantly fighting this rear guard action. And until we face that, until we face the investment nature and the structural nature that's actually built into the physical space. I always say, you know, we think about racism in the past as like white water fountain, the signs, and it was physical, and then we removed all of that, but it's still in the physical landscape because it was created based on those principles. And until we're prepared to talk about what would it take to dismantle it, whoever is the mayor of your local town, I'm thinking about Baltimore, right? You know, and it's not any individual mayor that I could say is responsible for what has happened to Baltimore. I'm not saying all of them have been great. But if we begin to really peel back the structural onion of Baltimore, you should want to know not why did Freddie Gray just get arrested and what happened to him in that van, but why was he living in that particular part of West Baltimore? And would he have been able to get to a job even if he was, you know, wanted to get to a job on the other side of town? And why were he and his sister so lead poisoned in the 1990s, even though we know everything we know about lead poisoning? So you have to then ask all of those questions. And I think until we deal with that structural piece, we're going to continue to think that a black face is the way we know that racism doesn't exist, when in fact that's not true.
So I'm going to invite you to our next conference on this.
Can I add just one word to that? The word that's not there is ghetto. The Carter Commission said we need to dismantle the ghetto. Concentrated black poverty is a government institution. And if you read James Forman's book, he basically said, you know, what's happening, the inequality you talk about between upper income people, black people, and lower income people, the structural thing is the structural consequences of concentrated black poverty. A situation where success is aberrational. Only 1% of concentrated poverty schools succeed, regardless of race, right? And if that structure exists, and yes, sometimes upper income black people are participating in the othering, right? Are supporting, this is what James Forman's book is about. You know, so there is a class dimension there, right? But if you've got that structure, you know, of concentrated poverty and you're not actively dismantling it or actively giving the denizens of ghetto communities access, you're going to get more of the same.
Well, I'm going to invite you to our next conference on this.
We should do. We really should do a conference on this.
We should. But I thank you so much for the comment and for the question, and we will continue dialogue. Well, thank you all for your questions, and thank you. And please give a round of applause for our amazing panel.
Thank you, Van, Jillian, and all of our speakers today, and for sharing what has, I think, been an incredibly powerful conversation, and for everyone sharing their stories. I'd like again to thank our underwriter, Fannie Mae, for making today possible, and your time is valuable with us. And before you go, I have one request. We have an email survey that will come out from me later today. There's also copies in the room. We'd really appreciate your feedback. It's important to us. Thanks again for being here, and we hope you'll stay a little bit longer and get to know the great people in this room. Thank you.